This is the last meeting of the class next week. Remember, you have off to work on your final project submissions, and those are due the following Sunday at 11:59 p.m. That's the beginning of finals week. I really can't take them like after that, so please don't turn them in late. I mean, like if you turn in at 2 o'clock in the morning instead of 11:59 p.m. Obviously, I'm not sitting up at 11:59 waiting eagerly to get your papers. So yeah, if you turn them at 2 or 3 in the morning, I don't care. But the next day when I come in, I will start to read them. Um, and it takes a while to read this many, fairly substantial papers, so I do need them on time. Um, does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. Well, that's easy for me.
I guess I actually have a quick question about the project in general.
Okay.
Um, when we were talking about like species that we're keeping,
Mhm.
are we free to just say that we have whatever species? Like it just kind of feels a little weird to, want to work with a species where they don't have a lot of them in captivity and then, you just so happen to have some. Like, do you want to see kind of a collection plan of us establishing those relationships?
Yeah.
Or can we just
So you can approach that in different ways. It kind of depends a little bit on the narrative, framing of your particular zoo that you're creating, right? What I don't want you to do is to go into like painstaking, lengthy background on that, right? Like I can't remember what the page limit I set on that was, but it's fairly short. So I don't want like a gajillion pages about your collection plan. I guess that would be my point. But if you want to I'm not worried that much about it. I think that might be the easiest way to say it. If you want to
okay.
go into that background a little bit because you think it's important to the narrative you're going to tell in the rest of the paper, then do that. But if it's not, you can kind of skip that.
Okay.
Does that make
Um,
sense, Bjorn?
Yeah, yeah, that's perfect. I did have a one other quick question.
Okay.
In the description, you talk about like I guess pictures and graphs, and you say that that does not count towards the word count, but I don't think you have a word count. You just have a page number. Is that what you're referring to? Like the
Yeah, it's
pictures?
yes,
Okay,
your
okay.
words are not diagrams. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ryan.
How strict are you with the page limits? I get a little keyboard happy, but um you have like 3 to 4 pages for the sources. Or sorry, for the solutions, and then it's like 1 page for something else, like your outline. How strict are you with those?
Oh, I mean, that's the general expectation. Here's what I think I talked about this earlier. Um, what I don't want is 6 pages about the background of your zoo. Like, I don't care that much. That's not the point of the paper. Does that make sense? So, if you burn up the entire paper talking about your fictional zoo, and it's essentially just like a fantasy zoo creation, I'm going to be extremely upset, and you're going to fail. Uh, if you if it's I said a page and you go page and a half on that particular subject because it serves the narrative purpose of what you're trying to establish in your paper, that's totally fine. So does that make sense? It's more about without essentially burning up all of the pages on nonsense, establishing what you need to establish to make your arguments. So those page limits are guidelines for sort of what I would expect is reasonable. There's a little wiggle room there. I'm not going to sit there and count the lines and be like, oh, you went over a line. You failed. That's not going to happen. All right. Does that make sense to everyone? Perfect. How many pages did I make this? I think I made it 12 again, right? One person shaking their head yes, the person shaking their head no. So
It says 12 to 15 on the
12,
prompt.
12 to 15. Yeah, so
Yes.
okay, that's what I thought. I think I was much nicer than I was last year. I think last year it was 20, so you're welcome. Um, okay. Is that all the questions about that? Okay. Well, we have plenty of stuff to talk about tonight since we missed last week, thanks to an assassination attempt on my life. So let's jump into chapter 12. So we'll just hop through chapter 12 and then, or module 12 and then into module 13. We'll just kind of flow through and see where we end up. There's lots of cool things to talk about in these chapters. So I guess 12:1 is not a particularly cool thing to talk about, but it's worth talking about. So, what significant problem are zoos facing in their attempts to meet conservation mission goals through reproductive management? Jasmine Anderson, ready to roll.
For this one, I had that zoos are having to compromise reproductive management among too few founder lineages and unsustainable zoo populations of endangered and even common species.
Yeah, so what does that mean, too few founder lineages? What problem does that establish um, for the zoos and for these conservation efforts? Bjorn.
Just means that like long-term viability of the population is in jeopardy because of genetic diversity or lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is a theme that has, I believe, come up 3 or 4 times in the various chapters, and there's a reason for that. It's a really important topic because, of course, one of the things that zoos do to justify their existence is talk about their ability to have these assurance populations, but in many cases, these assurance populations themselves are genetically unsustainable. That's a big issue. Um, I don't know if I think we've covered this before, but real quick question two, what is sustainability in terms of genetic lineages in captivity? I think we've covered this before. Tiffany.
Uh, the species retains 90% of genetic diversity derived from the wild source population for at least 100 years.
Yes, yeah. So that's how we define what it means to be sustainable in this situation. Okay. And I did that come up before? I feel like at least one other time that's come up. All right. Okay, question three. And this is definitely worth talking about. So the author states that zoos rarely have their own scientific research efforts. How can zoos that don't have these efforts, which is a lot of zoos, how can they begin to take that on? And what challenges are there as well? I think that's worth talking about. I know it's not on the page, but we can think about it. Go ahead, Bjorn.
So I think one of the main ways they were talking about actually going about that is through the hiring practice, hire more like full-time PhD scientists and conservationists um, that can actually do that research and make those projects happen. In addition to that, they were talking about, forging more partnerships or constellations, as you will, um, to help create, networks of conservation and to help them actually get their foot in the door with these projects.
Yeah, those are the two of the big core things, and these are things that we have touched on previously at various points, particularly the constellations. That's come up a lot. Um, so what are the challenges in doing those things? Taylor.
I think some challenges maybe is like cost because like hiring new people is going to cost a lot of money and it might not be in the budget for everybody. But I feel like there are some lower cost research projects that you can go into. Like I know some people are looking at the microbiome of animals. So basically, you just send like animal poop in, and they're looking at the bacterial composition. So there's not a lot of like time and effort and like money on there. And so there's options, but other options, can be definitely more costly if they're doing it in-house as well. I think another challenging thing is establishing partnerships. There's a lot of effort, and like relationship building that goes into that. So I think that can be another challenge as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, actually, relationship building can be really difficult. One of the ways that we do that, and I know some of you have experienced this, I think, is in when we go to conferences. So when you go to conferences, one of the big things with conferences is networking, meeting people that um, can lead to new opportunities for research or for particularly for you all who are much younger for potential job opportunities, right? You meet someone, you tell them about all this cool stuff you did and what you're passionate about, and 6 months later, someone's sending you an email and saying, "Hey, we have a position open up." Um, so there's like really two big things with conference networking, but yeah, the research opportunities are a big deal there. So that's one way. Now, of course, you can just call somebody up. Like you can literally just call someone and be like, "Hey, we have this cool project idea. We know you're an expert on this. Is this something, you would be willing to work on?" But what do you think? So let's say right now a zoo calls me and they know that one of the things that I do is bird banding. And they say, "We want to do this project and we want to do it in this location. And we want you to, you know, use your permit and ban these birds and find this information out." What am I going to ask them? Tiffany, go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
How are you going to be compensated?
Yeah, I might not ask how I'm going to be compensated.
But
That's
how the
honest.
project will be paid for,
Where
basically.
does the funding come to do this project is exactly what I'm going to ask them. I'm going to say something like, for me, and they would be lucky to get a hold of me because I'm not the kind of person that cares that much about money. As long as I have enough to live on, I'm fine. But I have students that I want to make sure get paid for their work. There's equipment involved. There's travel money, right? Even if not a single dollar goes actually into my own pocket, I don't want to spend money out of my pocket to do their project. So those things have to be paid for, and those things are surprisingly quite expensive. Even a small project. I mean, gosh, Cleo's research project, which was a relatively low expense research project, mostly involving travel and some sure stipends for some of the summer work we did. I'm trying to think. That probably came to maybe 11 or $12,000, and Cleo probably doesn't realize that, but maybe well, about half that would have been the sure program funding for students in a summer because they get a $3,000 stipend. Um, but yeah, these projects are really quite costly in the long run. That's for a small project. So that would be something I would ask them. And then there comes the cost problem again, right? Well, yeah, where is that money coming from? And then, so you guys were talking about cost of the project a few minutes ago. The other thing is cost of the PhD candidate, or not the candidate, the PhD that has applied potentially for this job. PhDs, some of us are suckers like me, and we go into academia and we make enough money to function. But the ones that are in, you know, private institutions, uh, they expect to make a pretty penny, and you have to pay for all that education, and that's not, um, it's not cheap. It's quite expensive. Those people make a lot of money. You've got to fork that out. And there are hidden costs that, maybe aren't really obvious to a lot of you when you hire someone. There are costs like their health insurance. That's getting paid for by the zoo in this case. Um, there's the overhead for whatever programs they're running in the spaces that they use. There's a lot of costs. So people are expensive. Do we think there's any other challenges to think about here or any other solutions? Caitlin.
So one potential challenge is like institutional hoops. For my project, I'm having zoos that are transferring tree kangaroos collect poop and send it to a lab, and I'm going to analyze it and everything pre and post transfer. And the SSP is the tree kangaroo SSP is like backing my project. So I thought it would be easier getting it through all the institutions involved, but there's a lot of hoops. And like, even as I send them my proposal that has all the answers to their questions, they usually send me more paperwork back that I have to fill out. That's like basically exactly what I just sent them, but I have to fill it out in like all of their documentation. And there's a lot of back and forth. And I know other academic institutions that have approached my zoo in the past have had to jump through a lot of hoops and have even been like, wow, like we've collaborated with other, organizations and not had to go through such a like big process. So I think that individual institutions' policies, especially as it relates to any sort of like welfare, can be a lot to like get through and get your project going.
Yeah, man, oh man. Red tape is my it's the bane of my existence. Every time someone gives me another form to fill out, or the same form to fill out a second or third time, I get uh, very frustrated. Some of it's necessary, but a lot of it's just superfluous. It just bogs down productivity. So I'm sorry that you're having to go through that. I feel your pain. Tiffany.
Uh, One kind of challenge is not all zoos are nicely located near like an institution of study. So like a
Hmm.
college or anything like that. Like my last facility, we were lucky. We were very close to three of them. But my facility right now, we're only close to a community college, not to like PhD nonetheless. So it's harder for us to form partnerships where people can easily get to us if they're staying like at the university or something like that. But one challenge we came across in my last facility wasn't actually anything to do with us or the people. It was the animals themselves. The study was specifically wanted to study the effects, the timeline of necrosis caused by red spitting cobra venom when they bite a rat. And we're
Yep.
like, okay, but our spitting cobra is opaque. She's not going to bite anything right now. And then like we can't just leave the rat in there. People are going to see that and things like that. So sometimes the animals are the problem, where no matter depending on what you want to study, they might not cooperate with you. So your institution might not be the best facility for that study in particular.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and I hadn't thought about that. I like the snake example. Um, of course, eventually the snake would have shed and should have been fine. So it was more of a choosing to do the thing at the very wrong time, right? Like if you just waited a few days, I mean, it probably could have worked out, but that's pretty interesting. That's a good point. I think there's probably also issues there similarly with say like behavioral studies and maybe animals maybe behaving in atypical ways that make certain studies and behavior difficult. I think that would probably be a big deal as well. Good. Great answers. All right. Well, apparently, when I wrote this question, I thought it was critically important. So let's see what it was. The time to do the need, this is a quote, the time to do the needed science and integrate it into standard zoo population management is when a species is still relatively abundant. This is truly an extremely critical point to talk about. What do you think about that statement, and are there any problems with that statement? Ryan.
Um, so I think this idea is really relevant to like assurance populations and having a species available for when the worst might happen in the wild. Um, but I think it also kind of leans more towards focus on them all. But in my opinion, if you focus on them all, you're putting less resources towards the species in greater need. So you kind of have to prioritize species in a way, and suggesting to kind of focus on them all um, challenges that. And I think I would just agree with prioritizing the species that need help, that we can help. And then that being said, research on other species is necessary, and I think there should be more of it, and there should be more focus on it, like what we just talked about, like maybe utilizing other organizations and universities to increase that, but not diminishing the work we're doing for threatened species.
Okay, great. Yeah. Very valid points. Caitlin.
So I said, I think that statement is valid and correct when an option, but sometimes it's just not logistically possible. Sometimes the population is already in decline, so there isn't an abundance of individuals to work with, or it can be a challenging species to study or one with low population density and a large range. And those sort of factors present challenges. And we already have species in zoos that are poorly understood and don't have reliable population numbers. So do we just give up on researching them? Like that doesn't seem like a good option either. And studying species while they're still abundant should be our goal, but it's just not always realistic.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not always realistic. It maybe even never if you're a zoo realistic. Very, very infrequently. Does anybody else have any thoughts about this? No one else has any thoughts. Okay. So first I want to say how could we create a system where we could sort of detect when we needed to start worrying about integrating uh, an animal of any persuasion into a zoo population? Like what would we have to do? What kind of work would we need to do to come up with something? Yeah. I'm gonna let Cleo go just because she hasn't answered yet. Okay, go ahead, Cleo.
You'd have to do like annual surveys of populations of every species.
Okay, well, yeah.
I
Tech,
mean, yeah, just to see if their populations are actually like declining, and then somehow set a standard for each species and what got too low for their populations, if that makes sense.
yeah, well, Cleo, let's just keep going here. I feel like this is something that's going to happen this feels like something that's going to happen during your defense. Cleo's defending very soon. Um, what would that look like? So you're doing, you said annual surveys. How would you make the decision that it's time? Like what would be your decision making threshold?
Well, I feel like the study would have to take place obviously over multiple years to actually see any trends in declining. I don't know how you would set like a percent of decline. I feel like, I don't know, 50%, let's just say 50% decline in I don't know, in like 5 years. There's something going on. Like
No kidding.
something needs to
That's
be,
a severe
something needs to
number.
be implemented. I
Jesus,
don't,
they get hit with a
I
nuke.
don't know.
Yeah, that's pretty severe. Uh, s- okay. Ryan, go off what Cleo said. You got to turn your volume up.
Just adding on to that, I guess, she kind of suggested that this needs to be collaborative. So I think for you determine if one specific species is in need versus another, this is going to have to be a global effort, and you're going to need researchers and conservationists and biologists from kind of everywhere working on this together. And I think for the specific decision, this is just off the dome. Maybe with the researchers trying to identify patterns that they're seeing, maybe even like with the habitat, with society patterns like human development or just urbanization of areas, stuff like that, could possibly predict if a species is going to be affected by a certain event or not. And that might be a good way to decide whether or not you should focus attention somewhere.
Okay. Taylor, you want to continue along there?
Yeah, I was just kind of when you said that, I kind of just like immediately thought of like the IUCN Red List. Like, is that like a tool that people, or zoos could use to determine like these studies that we're talking about? It seems like there are people doing it. I mean, I don't know how many times that I've cited BirdLife International this semester. Um, so I mean, there's like people doing it, right? So maybe that's something we could use. I agree that like sometimes like when you're looking at when these evaluations were done, they're a little old. Like it's definitely not as, frequent as Cleo, mentioned that she would like. But I feel like that's at least something that we could use to determine which species we'd like to be, maybe focusing on.
Yes, well, certainly. But so the thing with the IUCN Red List is you're, how do I say that? Putting the cart before the horse is not what's happening here, but it's sort of like that. You're like flipping the order in which things need to happen. That comes after the like status from the IUCN and Red List comes from the survey work, right? So you have to establish that before. So like you can't just get on IUCN and be like, "Yep, we're good." They said least concern because it's probably not been looked at in 30 years, 40 years. It might be unassessed ever, right? Um, so you you have to first establish the protocol to make the decision before you can make the decision. The IUC Red List is very useful, um, but it requires the survey work to have any meaning to it. And we can't constantly, obviously, we cannot constantly assess all species on the planet. We don't even know all the species on the planet to do that. So that's of course not realistic. So think about, some of you are in ornithology right now. Think about populations. What do populations do? We just did the population lecture was like what, last week or 2 weeks ago, if you're in there. What do populations do in general over time? How do they behave over time? You don't have to be in ornithology to answer this question. You just have to have had population ecology class. Jasmine.
Populations naturally fluctuate over time in response to resource availability, in response to weather events. I know recently in ornithology, I discussed bank swallows. For example, I think there's like flooding that occurs in Hungary every 10 to 15 years that decimates a population of bank swallows there. So a lot of surveys actually manage population trends by generation because of how populations naturally fluctuate. I know IUCN was mentioned, and a lot of times when you look at that, they'll do predictions by generation. And so if it's depending on the length of life of a species, if it could be like a generational decline over 3 generations of like 39%, and depending on the species needs, that could be alarming. So it's
Hmm.
really species by species, but they don't just focus on an annual basis. Annual basis would be really nice, but that requires a lot of effort and money. Um, for example, last year with the West Virginia DNR, I took place writing the West Virginia statewide wildlife action plan or whatever, and that's
Swap.
every 10 years. Yeah, the swap. That's every 10 years. And so that sort of decides potentially what's going to get surveyed over the span of 10 years. Obviously, they revisit it throughout that span of 10 years, but population work is over a very long time, a lot longer time than expected.
Mhm. Yeah, good. So the big thing I wanted to get to there is that they fluctuate over time. So like if let's say you do like a 3 or 4 year study, like you could do annual surveys. That is expensive. But it's depending on the program, it's possible. Um, it's going to naturally ebb and flow, typically around the carrying capacity for that population. Um, and sometimes that carrying capacity itself is going to shift. If you don't know about that stuff, go read a population ecology book and you'll learn about it in the first chapter. Um, but it's going to ebb and flow. Okay. It's going to go up and down and up and down. Uh, and through seasonal cycles, uh, due to all sorts of factors that act to regulate population size. And so like you can't even if you do something annually, let's say over a 3 or 4 year period, you're going to see natural fluctuations in your numbers and your estimates. So what you need is a picture of what that fluctuation looks like, what the sort of background normal amount of variance in the population looks like over time. And then you have to track that population over longer time scales, right? Over fairly long time scales. And what you might see then is a trend that is a downward trend, and it might be very slow. It doesn't have to be a sudden 50% decline. That would definitely be alarming. I don't think there's any doubt about that, unless that was within the normal variance that you would see within the population, right? But a slow and steady decline across time might suggest that something is going on. Definitely a significant decline, like um, 30% or whatever, that would be probably pretty alarming. I would think of it like a linear regression where you have time and your population size, and you're watching this line. Does it stay flat, relatively flat, right? Or does it slope downward? And how steep is that slope? That's telling you something about the rate of that decline. So um, that's a ton of work. Now imagine, as Cleo suggested, and Cleo was correct in saying this, we kind of have to do that for everything, right? Like if you truly wanted to be worried about every species, you have to do it for everything, and that's not realistic at all. So how do we choose which species that aren't already in trouble? How do we choose which ones to monitor? Bjorn.
You could do it by looking at like the threats or the stressors. Like if there are big threats to an ecosystem that you think might hurt the population, that can at least give warning bells to start looking out for that population decline. And so you can kind of analyze, you know, different ecosystems and species within that ecosystem, excuse me, species within that ecosystem based on what those threats are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you can think about, if you've got, you could take an ecosystem scale approach, basically, and then look at which organisms within an ecosystem are most susceptible to the impacts of that ecosystem. Basically, how specialized is an organism? How tight is its niche, its ecological niche, uh, in overlapping that particular system? Um, So I think that would be a reasonable approach. Might be very challenging to do because you're talking about assessing that system in terms of all the organisms in it, which is sometimes tens of thousands of depending on how complex of a system you want to talk about, and then figuring out which ones are most likely to not persist if that particular system is impacted heavily. Jasmine.
Indicator species.
Yeah. So you can use. So do you want to explain to everyone what an indicator species is, and then we can.
Yeah, I'll try. I'm reaching deep in the dome. So an indicator species is going to be a species that is kind of like a red flag. For example, if you're doing stream surveys and you're kick netting and doing all this work, and you're like, wow, we haven't found the brilliant three-pronged mayfly in this area for like this is the third summer in a row we haven't seen this mayfly, and we know for a fact that this mayfly is extremely sensitive to these levels. And then you can kind of look and see that the other animals that you're getting are kind of like hardier species, and you're not getting much of a not genetic, you're not getting much of a biodiversity in between. But having indicator species is a good way to get a glimpse at an ecosystem based on how a one species or a few different species are doing, because they are more likely to die off or abandon an area if it has poor quality or pollution or poor foraging areas and things like that.
Yeah, so ultimately indicator species are just species that are more sensitive to disturbance, right? And so when there's disturbance in an area, they're going to be the first species that start to show declines. So if you know which species in a system are more sensitive to that disturbance, you could track their populations. And if their populations start to decline, you know that other species in that same system are going to be, lagging behind in terms, they're going to be more resilient. So there might be okay now, but if this continues to be a problem, it might get to the point that it affects them as well. So yeah, I think using an indicator species to take this type approach that Bjorn's talking about is a pretty reasonable angle on things. Um, is there any other way you might, prioritize which species you're going to monitor? Yeah, Caitlin.
When I was in the amphibian department, we did surveys every year of the mud puppies in the Detroit River. And one of the reasons we did it was because, it was just said, they can be an indicator species for like the water quality in the river. But we also do it because it's like a native, and it's something that we can like very tangibly monitor at our zoo. So like it's kind of a convenience thing that also ties into amphibian care and indicator species and like environmental health, but like it's a local native species that not a lot of work has been done with. So we chose that. So zoos could try to prioritize things that are available to them easily.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good thing to point out is that if you're in Kentucky studying uh, what, uh, paradise tanagers is probably not the right choice because they're not there. Um, yeah, choosing things that are within your grasp is going to make that more affordable and more practical. So there's no doubt that that's an important consideration as well. What what about what if you, and I'm not saying this is right, okay? I'm not saying this is right, but what if you prioritize keystone species? So what are keystone species? Jasmine.
Keystone species are species in the ecosystem that are kind of like the Jenga block that if you pull it, the whole thing comes tumbling down. So it
Yep.
may not be the most sensitive species in the ecosystem, but it is, for example, if it's in the food web, it's probably got the most lines connecting to it or going through it or something like that. And prioritizing those typically means you're just going to do an overall system protection instead of, if you were to prioritize indicator species, you might not prioritize some of the hardier species that you may have a lot of, but they are still relevant to the ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, think of the keystone in architecture, right? If you pull the keystone out, the building collapses. That's the idea. So I'm not saying that's the best approach. I was just saying it's something that no one brought up. That is something that you could do. You could say, well, I'm going to focus my monitoring efforts on these particular species that are very important to the whole function of the system. Uh, so, does anybody else have any other thoughts? Is there any way zoos can do this at any level? Well, it sounds like Caitlin had a reasonable answer to that, actually. Tiffany.
In some aspects, like Caitlin said, if we focus on what's within our actual area, things we can easily and cost effectively study, things like that. So our local ecosystems. But the most important part, I think, is you have to form partnerships. Zoos cannot do it by themselves. It is basically required to form partnerships either with other zoos or other institutions, because we can't be in a bubble there. We can't do everything. We're already trying to do everything, and we found out that's not working for the majority of us. So we need help, and we need to form partnerships to get that help.
Okay, I agree with that. Jess.
I also agree with that. I was going to say zoos can't do it alone, but I was going to ask, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't zoos do like a flagship species approach, which like is why everybody hates the panda or whatever, because like it's a super popular animal and they probably pitched it in a way where like, well, if we all focus on the panda, we'll protect this habitat. But I feel like isn't that historically how zoos have done that approach? By focusing instead of like a keystone or an indicator, they'll focus on the species that's going to get them the funding in order to do this.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, I can't speak to the panda. In many cases, even those species, they're not necessarily the ones that are doing any population monitoring or anything like
That's
that.
true,
But it's
yeah.
like the justification for having this animal in a captive setting and is to claim an assurance population, right? And then you can have it, and people are like, "Yay, it's the pretty panda," or whatever it is. Um, yeah, but even in that case, I can't speak to the panda specifically, but in many of those cases, they're not the ones doing population monitoring. For the most part, if you look at, so like, let's just say like tigers, which I do know more about, it's not zoos out there doing boots on the ground, tiger population monitoring. That's not where that's happening. It does happen, but um, okay. So yeah, I'd agree. I think that integrating academia, state level institutions, and zoos together is probably the best way to solve this problem. But prioritizing the species is really, really difficult. Um, and usually like at the state level, so like if you think about, Jasmine was talking about the SWAP, the State Wildlife Action Plan, those species they are already species that are of some conservation concern. Does that make sense? They're not the species that aren't of conservation concern because it's difficult to justify putting the money into species that aren't at that point. And so now they're not all species that are like in a plummeting decline to doom. They're not all critically endangered or whatever, but they all have some amount of population need, or a monitoring need, I should say. Taylor, you had your hand up, and then Jasmine.
I kind of have a quick question. I was wondering if has anyone thought that by prioritizing species that are still relatively abundant, it would benefit like the people working in the field in the sense that like it can be really depressing trying to save species and failing over and over again? And do you think like the mental impact it has on people that are in the field, could be a reason to do so? Or if like maybe it would encourage other people to join the field because like maybe it's a little bit more positive. I don't necessarily have like a an opinion on either way or the other. I think it's important, but not a big thing. But I was just kind of curious on like what people thought about that aspect.
Well, I will I will say this in response to that. You're 100% right. There's a big difference between studying something super abundant and something that's relatively rare. Um, as someone that's messed around on both ends of the spectrum, to some extent, it feels really, really good to go out and just be able to find the animal you're looking for. That's a great feeling. Um, so definitely, I tried to do some stuff with these there's bees in the genus Nomada, and they're these little tiny um, kind of weird red-ish colored bees that don't have much hair on their bodies. They're very strange parasitic apids. Some of them are fairly common, but in general, they're not very common at all. And I found that it was very rewarding when I would find one, but it was also very challenging to get meaningful amounts of data on those bees. Um, what I would say, though, more than anything, in terms of the sort of mental well-being of the field researcher, is that I think that studies on more abundant species are very useful to younger field biologists, younger conservation biologists, where, and I don't mean like kids, I mean even like master's students. I just mean not like if you're my age and you're still like the only thing I care about is the most abundant things on Earth. Uh, I don't know. That seems a little bit ridiculous. But like as you're learning to become a scientist, studying things that are more abundant, it gives you the opportunity to get the field experiences you need to develop a skill set to go off and study things that are more challenging. Jasmine.
I was just gonna talk about how in the swap that was one of the things I was tasked with was the land snails of West Virginia. I had to go by each species, like over 100 species, and go through each and every risk that they faced and rank them like that. And so some of the snails that I did had far more risks than they did in the previous swap. Some snails had improved. And so it is a really lengthy, time-consuming process to do that. Um, and if I'm able to, I just wanted to say, as someone who does on-the-ground conservation research, um, there's nothing like finding your species of focus. And so even if you're well aware of the decline, there was nothing like finding a cheat mountain salamander or the Appalachian water shrew or getting a picture of the snowshoe hare on our trail cam. There was nothing like there's sometimes it's hard, but I think it's a different motivator. I don't think that the mental toll of working with species that are highly under threat and that we're losing was a high priority of thought in my coworkers when I was at the DNR or with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was more so motivation to work hard and save them and see them if we could.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Jasmine, because I don't know if you may have underestimated how difficult what you're trying to do for your thesis is. It's going to be so
Every
hard.
time I leave town and then I get a message on Discord that the kestrels are out. But when I go out to look for the kestrels, I just see them flying in the distance and I don't really have an idea of where they're roosting yet. So
It's a problem. It's a big problem. Um, well, you're about to be like full time in the field, so we're not
I've
far off
been
from that.
waiting for it.
It's coming. Caitlin.
I was just going to add one last little thing on field work that I think getting zoo people out into the field can be really good for them, not like just for mental health, but also having a broader picture of like conservation work and kind of seeing the other end of things and like what we're trying to contribute to, like actually getting out and being a part of it, I think can be really great for just like understanding the process and for bringing that messaging back to the zoo and sharing it with guests. Because like now you've actually done it and can like talk about it in a real way versus like reading about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I can speak from my perspective. to the opposite. Obviously, I don't work at a zoo per se. I work for the zoo science program, which I do zoo things. That's how I got this thing, doing zoo stuff, get mauled by a possum. It's the stupidest thing ever. Like, what the hell? A
To make
possum?
you feel better, I had a possum bite me in the chin, and she's the sweetest possum ever. So you are not alone. Two of us have been bitten in the face by a
Uh,
possum.
did yours leave a permanent scar? Little one. I think I'm going to have a gnarly thing here. Uh,
You do look really badass though. I hope you
thank
know
you,
that.
Bjorn. That
Bjorn.
does make me feel slightly better that I look badass. That's great.
You had your suit at the Academy of Sciences. I was like, oh, it's like James Bond. This is amazing.
I don't think James Bond had a facial scar. Well, the whole point of that was not the possum, not the bite. It was just to say that, uh, as I came into this position, I came in from a field biologist position and have got to see a lot more of the zoo side and get a better feel for that side and learn more about that side. So, and that's been beneficial to me. Ryan.
Yeah, I think it's really weird, Caitlin, that you brought that up because it's like super extremely relevant to me right now. I'm a newer, hi, this is my cat.
Hi, kitty.
I'm a newer keeper. And I've been full time for a couple of years now, but I think I have been starting to feel a bit stagnant. But then um we got these rescue primates, and I think it all just kind of blew up a little bit, and I was like much more interested, but realized I didn't know as much as I did, which is partially why I even got into this program because I was like, I'm just a keeper. I want to do a little bit more than that. And this course specifically is honestly like I've gotten a lot more well-rounded on stuff like this. I've formed, I think, more evidence-based and research-based opinions on things. I look at my own zoo differently, but I also got selected by our zoo to go to Guatemala, and I'm going to do some uh, field volunteering. It sounds like it's going to be a little bit more animal management, but on the field. But isn't something that I think I would have been a part of or even wanted to apply for had I not understood the zoo a little bit more. And I think it's really cool that my zoo, like Kayla was saying, like we're sending me out, and I'm hoping to get a different perspective on what I'm doing here at home and bring back ideas, bring back methods and strategies that they're doing out there, to hopefully make myself better, but also help my zoo. And thankfully, like I'm a yapper at work, so I yap with some of the higher ups, and I'm hoping some of them will listen to some of my ideas. I'm going to be presenting for um we have so many little presentation meeting things. It's called Pause for Lunch. But like you said, I think that that's a big aspect of what these facilities should be doing as well. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. I'm really excited.
That's wonderful. I'm glad that you got selected. I think you had mentioned that recently, but not that you had mentioned it was potentially happening, I think, but not that you had got selected. So congratulations. Um,
Thank you.
so do you know what you're going to be doing there? Because like, what specific task?
Yeah, so it's ARCUS. I don't ask me what it stands for. But they're located in Guatemala, north of Guatemala City, and they take in it's rescue and rehab for animals that are part of the illegal pet trade. I know they have a couple jaguars right now that were bought as pets and unreleasable. They release I think they have coatis, a bunch of spider monkeys I've heard, some they do some stuff with the larger like lizards and reptiles and amphibians out there, and then it sounds like they do a lot of tagging and poop searching and stuff. So and I might just be thrown into whatever they need help with. So there's a plethora there, but I think I got very disheartened seeing these little primate kids came in. They're Mexican spider monkey kids born in the wild, taken from the wild, and here they are. And I'm like, dang, that sucks for you guys. But if I can do a little something or even a little bit more to understand their situation and then better myself and my zoo to help them and others like them. Like what messaging, especially with what messaging I can bring back from my experience that I can chat with the public about. So I think I'll be doing a lot of animal management there, but I'm hoping to bring back a lot more of like conservation education.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's wonderful. Okay. Um, see if we can get through like maybe just one more short question. We went in a lot of different directions there. How did we get to sustainability? Are we already in the sustainable development chapter? Is there 13 also has sustainable development? Is that what I'm doing? I feel like there's a bunch of yes, okay, that's why. There's sustainability in multiple chapters. Okay. We'll come to that later. Okay, let's talk about question 6 and then we'll take our break. So in what way are zoos chimeras and how does this exacerbate the challenge of sustainability? And while you're at it, tell us what a chimera is. Annabeth.
Okay, I think I remember what a chimera is in like mythology, but it's a
Hmm.
mythological, I think it's goat, lion, dragon,
Nailed
I
it. Yeah.
think. Nailed it. Thank you, Wizard 101. Okay, but zoos are chimeras because they are a combination of businesses, conservation bodies, and schools. That's at least what the chapter said, and I agree with that.
Yeah. So the other part of that question though is how does it exacerbate the challenge of sustainability?
Oh, I forgot that part of it. Um, exacerbate the challenge of sustainability. Tiffany has her hand raised, so she can help me out, possibly, maybe.
All right, Tiffany.
So one problem is that if they don't have animals, they can't be any of those things. And the zoos depend on a steady supply of animals in order to drive attendance and then make money. So if they fail to innovate and develop effective species sustainability, there's catastrophic consequences. Without sustainable populations, there is no zoos, and they cannot be any of those things.
I think that was a pretty good answer. Does anybody else have any other thoughts? Bjorn?
I was gonna say that it's challenging with the direction of funds and resources. So if the zoo puts a lot of resources into maintaining like the business and the school aspect of the chimera, it detracts from the conservation impact they could potentially have.
Yeah, yeah, obviously it's balancing those things is from a resource perspective is really, really challenging. Yeah. So you want to have any other thoughts? Ryan.
This is just maybe a little silly, but do you have like an opinion on which aspect of zoos is which part of the chimera? Like what would be the lion head and what would be the goat body?
I, I I don't have an opinion, but I'm going to give the goat to business because it's the least fearsome of the three. Um, I'll give the school to the lion and the dragon to conservation. I believe that is the appropriate. Yeah, I feel like the lion, it could be like a wise old teacher. And the dragon's the fearsome beast that has to tackle the challenge of conservation. I think that's it. So whenever you want to make a cool logo with a chimera on it, you know what it all represents now. All right, let's take our 8 o'clock break. It's 8 o'clock, so perfect timing, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes. So see you at 8:10. Okay, welcome back. No, shoot. Give Jasmine a moment to get back here. Okay, let's skip ahead to question 9. The previous couple questions are things we've definitely discussed previously. Does being a regional zoo, impose any challenges or limitations on the zoo? Jasmine Anderson.
This one I said that I don't think it imposes and challenges or limitate sorry imposes and challenges or limitates or causes limitations for the zoo, and I believe it actually makes the zoo special because of their focus being on that specific region.
Okay, okay, I like that take. Tiffany. Tiffany, something's up with your mic.
There we go. My
Okay,
mic
yeah.
wasn't down. So speaking logistically as someone who works at a regional zoo, there are limitations strictly legally. There are regulations based on what animals you can obtain, how you can obtain them, what you are allowed to do with them, for example, breeding. So I am not allowed to breed timber rattlesnakes, for example, at my facility due to state limitations. But there's also limitations to where I can get my animals from and how I can get them. So, for example, we recently found out my facility is not capable legally of uh, having a moose or an elk from brought in from out of state due to New York regulations based on chronic wasting disease. They are capable of having it, so because it's actually the only reason is because we're not AZA, which that's a whole different thing. But based on state laws and state DEC regulations, everything, there are limitations in that sense that we are physically and legally not allowed to bring these organisms into New York State from a different state, a different country, things like that. So logistically, yeah, there are actually lots of limitations, but those challenge like that's kind of it's easier to care for them and things like that. So that kind of it depends on which you find more challenging.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good answer. Annabeth, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was also just going to say that there are a couple limitations, specifically with collection planning and sustainability, because it's limited, because, like Tiffany said, probably fewer institutions probably have access to those animals, and thus less people would have them for, switching in between zoos and breeding purposes and also research.
Okay. Taylor.
I think the book mentioned that they're underfunded and understaffed, which obviously will put limitations on the zoo. So I definitely think if it's a regional zoo, it'll have its limitations. I think they're just like generally less popular. There's gonna have like less people coming in. Like people are more interested in seeing exotic animals. It's kind of what zoos are known for. And if you have less people coming in, you're gonna have less money and you're gonna have less impact on like with your educational programs and things like that. So I think like just like impact overall is gonna be another limitation that these zoos are gonna have.
It's a really good point about the impact and the exotic animals. Ryan.
Touching on what Taylor was just talking about, but this wasn't something I thought about during my response to this, but I think um, location and other surrounding facilities kind of has an impact on more regional zoos. For instance, like I'm from Omaha, we have a big zoo, but we also have a safari park. And so And honestly, while we were talking about parks and more local stuff, this whole time I've been like, well, ours is pretty good. Like people know about it. People like those animals. People know more about those animals, stuff like that. But we also have a big, huge zoo where like all these hundreds of memberships that we have also get you access to the park. So they get help that way. But looking at the park in general, that houses, more local species. We have bears, elk, they also have bison, and wolves. And it also has our tiger breeding facility and cheetah facility. Um, Behind scenes and stuff, but even just looking at them in general, like they struggle with their accreditation more, they have less staff, they pull staff from the zoo to help them with projects because they don't have enough for it. Looking at their facilities, they need redone. Some of them just need updated. So look, even with a big zoo kind of connected to them, like they have these struggles still, which was enlightening from this.
Yeah, yeah. That's all great points, Bjorn.
Just one final thing to add to all of that. I think it really limits the ability of the zoo to have a global conservation impact. As soon as they focus on just like regional animals, they immediately limit their ability to actually help with like projects for threatened species around the world. And so because of that, they really limit what they can actually do with conservation projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Though I guess it does have the advantage of if it's a local conservation project, it's as we were discussing earlier, it's more accessible and affordable and easy to do. But yeah, it limits the scope of what they can do for sure. Ryan?
Yeah, sorry, not to like contradict, but I feel like I read somewhere in the book that doesn't North America have one of the like most endangered species or something like that? Am I getting that wrong? Like we have a just a large amount of endangered species specifically in North America compared to other parts of the world.
We had
Anyone remember this?
well, I don't remember the specific, statement in the book, but in general, yeah, we do have a great number of endangered species. Jasmine.
Something I thought was really interesting that I learned recently in my research for my paper was that like over half of like reintroductions in North America are from captive bred sources, but a very small percentage of that is zoos. So a lot of zoos in North America aren't really um paying attention to their backyard, which I think has been discussed before with issues of sustainability within that. So that's just a point that I have.
Yeah, absolutely. Caitlin.
I just wanted to follow up and ask where are those animals coming from? Like that are going into reintroductions that aren't from zoos. Who is sourcing those animals or breeding those animals?
Jasmine, do you want to answer that question?
I would if I like remembered from the paper, but I just remember reading that stat and was like, whoa, but like I can dig up the paper right now. It's on my Zotero.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, go ahead and dig it up because you have the specific stat. But, there are private breeders for a lot of different organisms. Obviously, depends on what you're talking about. There are, um, in some instances, specific government agencies that are doing breeding programs, particularly when you're talking about like fisheries programs and things like that. Uh, and I don't know as much on the academic side. I'm not as sure about the academic side of things. Uh, but Jasmine's going to find out from her paper, and we'll all know slightly more. All right, we'll move on, and then Jasmine can jump in when she finds that. Ultimately, I will say I liked what Jasmine Anderson said that their particular limited scope does make them special. I do think it is important to note that there are limitations, and you guys have highlighted all of them very well. But I mean, any of you that have visited a regional zoo or work at a regional zoo know that they're pretty like they're a really cool thing. I love those smaller zoos with, the regional life. I really like that. I mean, I'd rather them all be out in the wild, but I know that that's not always possible. We have one here in West Virginia at French Creek that I really like. And a cool thing about that, I don't know how all the other regional zoos are, but at French Creek, it's like literally like a walk through the woods, and all the enclosures are in the forest, and you're walking through the forest on a trail, and you come to the different enclosures, and it's a really cool experience. It's not that big, but it's nice. Um, so question, so we get into some aquarium stuff at the end of this section. What do we want? Okay, I don't really want to talk about that. Let's see. Okay, let's talk about question 12. And so question 12 is, do you think that visitors visiting aquariums with conservation messages feel that they are, through the act of visiting, performing a conservation action? I am 100% sure I can write that sentence and much better than I did. But basically, the idea is a visitor comes to an aquarium. The aquarium is providing some conservation message to the visitor. Do they feel like just because they visited then that they have performed a conservation action? And if is that ultimately a good or bad thing? Tiffany.
Uh, I said that I think generally people who are going to the aquarium don't think they're performing conservation action. That's not the reason they're visiting an aquarium. They're going for an enjoyable day, an enjoyable outing. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, particularly because I feel like most marketing for zoos and aquariums, they're not really incorporating their conservation message. So people, that's not the forefront of people's minds when they think about visiting an aquarium. Um, they're more thinking of the commercial they saw about like this really cool habitat they have, other than the fact that, yeah, if I go to the aquarium, I'm helping them raise money for this action. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because incidental conservation is still conservation. They're still helping to, again, raise funds. They're helping in some aspect. So just because they don't know they're doing it doesn't necessarily detract the fact that they are participating.
Okay, sure. Caitlin, what do you think?
I agree with Tiffany. I don't think just by going that people feel that they're contributing to conservation, with the exception of if they're going to an event at an aquarium or a zoo that's specifically marketed that way. Because, like, we do various fundraising events, and I've seen them at aquariums too, where it is like, oh, like come to this zoo brew and it's going towards this cause. I think then people feel that way and feel like they've contributed to something good, but I think by just attending, they don't necessarily feel that way.
Taylor.
Yeah, I do agree in some ways that like people don't know, maybe majority of people don't think that, but if some people do, I think this can be problematic. Because if they think like, oh, like just by buying a ticket, that's enough, you know what I mean? Like I did my part. And I think that's a little bit of a dangerous way to think because it's not enough necessarily. Like I think like people should be contributing more, and I fear that if they feel like their ticket is a contribution, they don't really need to do anything else. So I think that's something that kind of concerns me about like having that mindset. I don't think a majority of people have that mindset, but if someone does have that mindset or people like start to have that mindset, it can be an issue.
Yeah, you can become complacent. Like, well, 10% of my ticket went to conservation, so I can check off my stewardship needs for the month or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Bjorn.
I wrote answer that I think at least some people believe that way, that they are doing like an act of conservation if they're like going to an aquarium or something, especially if the aquarium is advertising as such. If they have that within their exhibits and stuff, I feel like a lot of people would probably feel pretty good about that. And I think whether or not that's a good or a bad thing really sometimes also comes down to the aquarium and what they are actually doing. Like if they are allocating funds from the ticket sales to, in situ or ex situ conservation efforts, maybe that's a valid reaction. But I think a lot of that is reliant on how the aquarium is actually, allocating their funds from the visitor and how they are portraying that to the visitor. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Ryan?
Just adding on to what Bjorn just said, I think it can be good, but also shouldn't be the end goal for the zoo. Like the zoo shouldn't just be complacent with, or that's what's a better word? They shouldn't just be satisfied with that being the level of conservation messaging they're getting across is people thinking, oh, well, I paid money to get in here when now my money is off into the conservation world. So a lot of the education aspects, calls to action specifically like, hey, what else can you do? Like maybe a lot of people are just like, okay, I bought my ticket, I participated that way. How else am I supposed to help? And I think zoos should maybe make that more clear so that even if people are just contributing financially through a ticket, they can contribute other ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cleo, you had your hand up and then you took it down. Did Bjorn steal your thunder? Is that what happened?
Uh, kind of adjacent, I guess, but I was just gonna go off of Taylor and say that like they shouldn't be complacent and that they should have like the educational programs for encouraging pro-environmental behavior to like actually make changes in their lifestyle to better conservation than just financially.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I think, there were two camps here. Some of you said no, some of you said yes, and had reasons for that. I think there's like truth in what everyone said. I think it's true that in general, people visiting the zoo are probably not thinking about conservation, but I think that changes a lot of times at the front gate. Or the aquarium, or this is aquariums, but it's the same difference. At the front gate, when there's a sign that talks about how ticket sales support conservation, or when you buy stuff from our gift shop, it supports conservation or whatever. Um, it does not necessarily ticket sales. Um, and then now you came for the good time, but then you're like, oh, that makes me feel good when I buy this t-shirt. Also, I'm doing this good conservation thing for nature. Um, when in reality, the amount of money that goes toward conservation from that t-shirt sale is it probably not enough to offset the uh, the fact that that t-shirt is going to go into a dump eventually, and all the waste that was produced in transporting that t-shirt and everything else. Uh, but it's sort of a sort of deceptive in that way. And so I think they can go from I'm going to have a good fun day to still having a good fun day, but also kind of thinking they did something good for conservation just by purchasing something. Um, and that this could make someone complacent to be like, well, I've done something, you know, I feel good about this. I did something good for nature. Uh, I did more than that guy over there did. He didn't buy a t-shirt, so he's done less than me. Uh, and you might not think that consciously. I don't think, very often people consciously think about that, but even subconsciously, I think that you could think that. So, and that could make you a little more, uh, or a little less likely to maybe do some other conservation action. But if the aquarium does a good job with its messaging, maybe they can get both, and that's a point to take. Jasmine.
I was just gonna say, I found the stuff on my paper, but
Okay,
I was just waiting for you guys to finish up with this question.
we're done. Go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, it says Organizations other than zoos that breed animals for release in greater number are often taxon-specific facilities at governmental, academic, and private organizations, and it lists some examples like the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland,
Yep.
University of Florida, San Rafael Aviaries, and the one I thought of was Bat Conservation International. And it also says state and federal wildlife agencies in particular are heavily involved in North American conservation translocations.
Yep.
And the actual stat itself, over half of published North American animal conservation translocations included releases from captive bred populations, yet only 1/4 of such captive bred species releases come from zoos. This is lower than the 32% contribution of zoos to captive breeding for releases published in the GRP studies and the 59% reported in a study by Beck et al. In 1994. Zoos are more likely to release amphibians and terrestrial invertebrates than mammals, birds, and reptiles, and have a negligible proportion of zoo-bred fish at 2% and marine invertebrates at 0%.
There you go. Yeah, so I think I said private government, and I was not sure about the academic contribution to that, but it sounds like at least the University of Florida is doing something. I don't know what they are releasing. That's pretty interesting. It's probably snakes. I mean, it's Florida.
It's snakes. Yeah, it said it was like reptile heavy,
Mm.
but mostly like amphibians and invertebrates, but still only 1/4 of the
Of the
releases in North
50%.
America.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty dire, but
When you think of, I would point out when you think of the fact that zoos are supposed to be the premium place for the breeding of animals for conservation, that is, kind of questionable. So maybe everyone go to your zoos and start cracking the whip. Yeah. uh, it's an interesting statistic. Okay. For the sake of time, we're going to skip a couple questions so we can eventually get here into chapter 13. We'll talk about 15 real quick. I don't think we need to talk deeply about this, but so 15 is, how does the large immersive aquarium directly contradict its own conservation goals when emphasizing the impact of climate change? Taylor.
I think they contradict themselves in a way that like it's just kind of hypocritical because the amount of CO2 emissions that they're kind of putting out into the world kind of defeats the purpose, and like they're just leaving a pretty large ecological footprint. Additionally, a lot of the wild, they rely on a lot of wild populations to fill their tanks, so they're just kind of like taking out of the places that they're supposedly trying to help. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. A ton of energy goes into running these I mean, we're talking, I mean, you guys have been, probably most of you have been to a big aquarium. Like, it's like walking under the ocean in some of these places. Like, there's a massive, massive tanks, and keeping that water all clean and doing all the things that have to be done to maintain that system is very energy intensive. Um, so it's a very hypocritical in a way. Now, that being said, I love the aquarium. Let's just be honest. Okay, let's move on to this rethinking dignity in animal conservation. Pull a question from this before we move on. Let's talk about 19. So, what is Brower's idea of extinction with dignity, and how do you feel about it? Bjorn, answer the question. You had a big old grin on your face. I just feel like this is a Bjorn question. I don't know why. I feel like Bjorn has an answer to this question. I've called you out, Bjorn.
So yeah, no, that's perfect. I had a lot of feelings about this question. I was just trying to find it on
So
the sheet again.
it's the last,
Um,
very last question.
okay, perfect. Yeah, I think that this was one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, to be honest. And I think it was because the author of this chapter, and I can't remember who it was, Mendelssohn, was that? I think it was Mendelssohn. He really went after this idea and he definitely did not hold back. And I think it's also an absurd idea. I don't think that there's quite frankly any value behind it. Um, there's no reason that we should be, placing like the idea of dignity on animals. Like there's no reason that us helping animals should make them actually lose their dignity. And the author, he said something about like these guys kind of putting their own ideas of like masculinity and stuff onto these, wildlife species. And I think that that really kind of sums it up for me as well. It's this idea of it's like, oh, if you ask for help, like you're not a man, like you lose your dignity. And I think that really kind of plays a really big role in this conservation because there's absolutely no reason to say it's like, oh, if we're helping this species, it's no longer that species. Like they lost kind of all value within the ecosystem. I don't even want to see it anymore. It's just really an absurd thought to me, and I don't see any value actually behind it at all.
All right. What does everybody else think? Does anyone agree with Brower? Does anyone think Bjorn is incorrect? It is okay to think that. Tiffany.
Okay, I don't agree with Bauer, but I wanted to say there is in one specific instance where I think it is not necessarily better, but okay to allow the species to just kind of gradually make its way out. And that is if we are having so much trouble trying to keep them in captive care. We literally, these animals are suffering because we cannot figure out how to properly care for them. Then maybe there is something where be like, okay, well, we can't do anything anymore. We'll try to save the habitat they're in, but if they end up going, we did our best. And I think in that instance, that's more, I don't want to see unnecessary suffering because we are trying too hard to save them by bringing them into human care, and we're just killing them left and right because we cannot care for them. And in some cases, it feels like we're killing them with kindness, which I also don't believe in, where I feel like that's kind of yeah, give them the dignity in this case to just go. We can't do anything more.
Okay. Bjorn.
I just wanted to add one more thing, kind of in Brower's defense for, I guess, when he said that, is that he said this a very, very long time ago. So the vision, at least for me, of that like we have of zoos today, I feel like was very, very different back then. And they probably weren't viewed as, conservation hubs as they are now. And so he probably had really terrible experiences in zoos. He probably went to zoos, saw really, really poor welfare, saw some really, really sad and stressed animals. And that's kind of his vision of what zoos were and what was going to happen to the condor. And so I think that's at least valuable to have that perspective a little bit. So I'm not completely getting down on Brower, but I think that we've made a lot of strides in the conservation work and just in zoos in general since he has made those statements.
Okay. Ryan.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Tiffany and Bjorn have said, and don't really agree with pretty much most of what Bauer has um for his views, but I can appreciate that he at least attempted to try to find a way to help the species initially without being super invasive, though that option overall wouldn't have worked out. I do think that's an important concept that we might need to still lean into a little bit, like, can we help a species without doing all of these invasive things, such as captivity or um, extensively capture or anything, but like also it's okay if you have to catch a bird and measure its wing and let it go kind of deal. But I think just being aware of how much you're actually doing so that you aren't doing just these extensive things where it's like they have poor welfare, kind of more onto what Tiffany said as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the rare times that I find myself unable to play devil's advocate. Um, I literally cannot put myself in Brower's shoes, and I'm very good at doing that. I cannot see, with a single exception, how the logic in his thought process, other than the sort of, as Bjorn mentioned, like I am a man, masculinity kind of thing that you kind of have going on here. Um, the perhaps exception, which pretty much so doesn't really exist in our world today, but which I can see this being reasonable, is in a circumstance in which, let's say, we were monitoring a species that was going extinct. We knew that it was headed in that direction, but in which no anthropogenic impacts were significant contributors to that extinction. And so it was a natural, like there's a natural background extinction process that is constantly happening, right? And in those cases, in those cases, we would actually be interjecting against the natural process of extinction. In which case, I would agree with Brower that perhaps the appropriate thing to do in that situation is to allow that process to occur. What do you think? Does anyone disagree with me? Yeah, Caitlin.
I don't disagree. I had a question on that. Can anyone think of an example of that occurring currently? Like everything I can think of where usually the problem, like something people are doing is kind of causing the extinction. I can't think of any like naturally occurring extinctions that don't have like a pretty big ripple effect.
Yeah, that's why I qualified that by saying that it doesn't really probably exist in our current world. So it's more of a thought exercise than anything else. But I don't know. Jasmine, what do you think?
So my first thought was actually Tasmanian devils and the devil facial tumor disease they have. Because I don't think that's an anthropogenic cause to that disease. But then I thought, well, they wouldn't be having such a hard time responding to this disease if they hadn't been extirpated by people. So
Mhm.
even now, if the major threat is not a human, like a human indirect or directly caused, um, a lot of animals wouldn't be struggling with these threats if they didn't also have to put up with us. So I couldn't think of anything.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like if it's a disease that exists within that population, and that, it's like, well, we didn't make the disease. We didn't lab craft a disease to ruin these species' lives. But the other pressures we created have exacerbated that problem significantly. And I don't know of a situation, it might exist on some remote island somewhere right now. There's probably some species that has virtually no significant anthropogenic impacts that is going extinct because that's just a part of the natural background process of life. But if we know about it, we've probably impacted it in some way. And most things that we don't know about, we've impacted. I mean, just think about shifts in global climate caused by human effects. That's global in its scope, and even if there's no humans in that place, climate is still has still been impacted, for example. So, but I do think that if we use that as a thought experiment, we can find a way to identify with Brower's idea. Very good. So let's move on to the week 13 readings. It's the last set of readings, and we'll spend the last hour or so working our way through some of these questions. Our first question is we'll just do question one. Why is the Ark, as in Noah's Ark, a poor metaphor for modern zoos? Or do you disagree with that and you think it's a very good metaphor? That's also okay. Jasmine Anderson.
I put that it does a poor job of reflecting the complexity of nature and social systems, and because of this, provides a weak foundation for the very mission it implies, which is conservation of wildlife.
Okay. So, Annabeth.
It may also kind of encourage that stamp collecting mentality that we talked about early on, because, well, not historically, but with the Ark, they were like, oh, let's get one of each. Well, two of each. Oh my gosh, my brain's all messed up. Let's get two of each. You don't really want to do that in a zoo because that's not a very good way of keeping animals, especially if you have, I don't know, two of every single species. That's not very realistic at all.
Yeah, yeah. Particularly if you're trying to create a sustainable inter-zoo population. Tiffany.
Not even just the having two of everything, but the legitimately having every single organism in a facility is physically impossible. We cannot have a population of every single organism, even just animals, let alone plants as well. So that's what they're trying to say is we're going to have everything, but we can't, and we can't pretend that we can.
Yeah, yeah. It's uh much like the Ark. It's very yeah, you can't do that. You can't do it on a boat. You can't do it on the ground. Like it's just not possible. There's no version of that that makes any sense at all. Um, yeah. Well, anything else? Does anybody have any other thoughts? Jasmine, Kyle.
I wrote that that narrative is kind of not the narrative that zoos want to tell anymore, that they're this refuge in a doomed world. I think that zoos are moving past that and wanting to be more active pieces in conservation, and that the world isn't doomed, and that we can all sort of step up and do a little something to save it instead of just grab all the animals, let's hold on to them because there's no point in trying to protect the wild anymore.
Okay. Yeah. One thing, and I know this is just in my notes from a couple years ago. I don't remember if this is actually in the chapter, but I'll let Annabeth go. Annabeth, go ahead.
Okay. I just have to talk about this. I remember I wanted to talk about it like early on whenever we talked about like stamp collections, but so whenever I'm driving home, I pass by Williamstown, Kentucky. And I don't know if you've kind of been like down I-75, but there's this place called the Ark Encounter, which is I'm not going to call it a zoo because I don't think it's a zoo at all, but it's like kind of a theme park where it's like a giant ark, like a giant wooden ark. And they kind of have it planned out where there are rooms in there where it's like this is where the animals were kept. But they do have like animals. They have like emus and like what else am I seeing here? I had to go check because apparently they do have like animals and like I see like camels and wallabies and kangaroos. And I just think that we were talking about how, modern zoos are kind of stepping away from that method, but there are still facilities that are trying to like not to hate, but are trying to have that
Mhm.
perspective.
Yep.
I just
Yeah,
I just I like to mention the Ark because I pass by it on my way home and I see the very top of it through the trees. And part of me really wants just to like look at it one day and see what's like peeking over the fence to see what's going on.
I thought they had all like fake animals, like statues or
They have no, they
carved.
have real animals at this one.
I know about the Ark Encounter. Yeah, it's wild stuff. I'm a little bit afraid to talk about it just because I don't want to lose my job. So, Bjorn.
I thought the same thing. I know one of the guys who's actually a keeper there. Great guy, Channing. He's friends with Loafman. Our Ackies at West Liberty came from the Ark. The babies came from
Really?
the Ark. Yeah, Channing bred them. He's a great guy. He's a great keeper, extremely knowledgeable when it comes to like reptiles and stuff. And so I was talking to him for a long time about the Ark, and they have some very, very cool animals there. So I really want to go as well because it is absolutely definitely not what I was expecting, at least, just seeing it surface level.
Yeah, I thought the whole thing was like it's just supposed to show what the Ark was really like when you go inside, right? Like I thought that was the idea. So that's very interesting. I had no idea. And yeah, I'm curious. I would absolutely go.
Trip.
Not yeah, road trip next week, next Tuesday night, 7 to 10 p.m. We, Caitlin.
Okay, we don't need to like deep dive this, but like it's a creation museum, right? Like
Yes.
that that's their jam. Okay.
Yeah. That, that's why I
They are
said
actually,
I'm afraid to talk about
yeah,
it.
they're partnered with the Creation Museum as well. So they're the same under the same umbrella.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. We don't need to get on a discussion about religion, just because that's a sensitive topic. But in general, it's pretty nifty. That's what I'm going to say, and we're going to move on. All right, the Ark. That's a very good thing to bring up. How the heck did we get to that? Oh, because why is the Ark a poor metaphor for modern zoo? That is funny because it's literally an Ark that is a modern zoo. I don't know how modern is. Has anyone been in this thing? I just tried to look at pictures of it, and the pictures actually show what I thought they had, which was like carved wooden animals in tiny cages. So I just wondered if anyone had actually seen inside of it.
I will say that Channing has shown me pictures of it, and it looks, I mean, from what he's shown me, it looks great. It looks just like any other modern animal facility. So
Yeah, maybe the
I don't know.
pictures I'm seeing online are not like the core of the zoo. Maybe they're just like artistic renditions of things, I don't know. I mean, just Google it and look at the Google images and you'll see what I'm talking about. So the one thing that I have in my notes though that I wanted to get to is that it doesn't the idea of the ark and its in the animals two by two thing doesn't in any way, shape, or form reflect the reality of conservation and the interconnectedness of life, any of that. And so is sort of the complete opposite of, and you guys kind of alluded to this, the narrative that modern zoos are trying to pass to their visitors. Are you guys just all looking at pictures of the ark right now? I can tell some people are just like, did anybody find any pictures of live animals in this ark?
Well, the zoo itself is called like the Ararat Ridge Zoo. Ar
So it's
Ararat Ridge Zoo.
okay. So
Can't read that.
yeah, sort of. That's not the ark.
It is. It's connected to the Ark Encounter. That's like the zoo of the Ark Encounter.
Ah, okay. I must do more. I'll do more research on this because it's pretty interesting. And now, as a matter of fact, I'm going to put it in my notes right now because if I don't, I'm never going to do it.
I found it on TikTok, just but
It's the
it
Ark
does
Zoo.
look like a modern zoo, kind of.
Huh. Very interesting.
If you go to the bottom of their website, it does have for plan your visit the Ararat Ridge Zoo. So it's not like the big part of the Arc Experiences website, but they do mention it, that they are connected to it at the bottom, like with all the rest of the stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Next question, and just let's not spend a lot of time on this question because there's a bunch of questions that are like building off this question. What is sustainable development and how does it tie into zoo? Well, just to conservation, period. Straightforward question.
Which question? You said that really fast.
I'm sorry, it's question two. It's what is sustainable development and how does it tie into conservation? Ryan.
I think just kind of the overreaching idea for sustainable development is meeting human needs as well and addressing human environments and social situations that can then lead to environmental protection or have ties to. One of the examples I think they talked about in the book was just I think it was like poverty, poor education, incarceration, stuff like that, and how that affects people's connections and relationships with the environment and with wildlife. And to better improve people's relationships with wildlife, to then improve wildlife, you have to also support people's lives. So it's a cool concept.
Okay, there's one thing I think we need to add to that though. So you've got the first part, which is the part in the present, what we have to do now, but the part that's missing that you didn't say is that the sustainable part means that we harvest from the environment in such a way that in the future we can keep doing that. That's what makes it sustainable development, right? That it's the idea that we don't harvest resources in such a destructive and sort of egregious fashion that those are lost for future generations. So like overfishing so that fisheries uh, collapse, or over harvesting timber so that there's no more timber, or over harvesting coal or oil, whatever, so that future generations don't have those resources. Those are unsustainable practices, right? So that's a very important point to sustainable development, is not just thinking about us right now, but what do I want my descendants, or in my case, I'm not going to have any descendants unless something very strange happens. But what do I want my nephew to have in the future? And what do I want his lineage to have in the future? What do I want all your children to have access to in the future? Um, so it's a somewhat challenging thing because it requires people to be slightly less selfish, right? You have to think about people that aren't even alive yet, potentially, and what their lives will be like based on the actions that you take. That's pretty difficult for some people to do. Um, but it's a very important part of the concept of sustainability. Uh, so that's sustainable development. Um, I guess I kind of got into this a little bit already, but what are some of the challenges of sustainable development? There's a lot. I just talked about one, which was the somewhat selfish nature of many people. Tiffany.
Uh, in order to like develop these approaches, understand them, predict them, you have to realize that ecosystems and the social systems we're trying to talk about, they're complex and they're dynamic. So there's lots of stuff in them and it's constantly changing. So you have to be able to kind of think about what might change in that aspect and predict how you could approach that. And that might not necessarily happen, but you might need like contingencies of how to approach things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Jasmine Kyle.
Except entropy. There will always be unplanned chaos in things. Always. No matter how much you plan for, and instead of viewing these things as failures, you just accept them as part of the, as Tiffany said, the complex nature of these systems that we're working with. I also put technological ability, keeping up with things that are constantly changing. We're fast with our technological advancements, but not that fast. Sometimes things are just beyond our scope, but that's part of building a really powerful plan, is being able to sort of at least veer in the direction that you think you would like to go.
Yeah, yeah, good answer. What else? Cleo.
Pretty general, but just to add on, I feel like these plans have to be somewhat practical too, to actually get them to work, like not super outreaching, but something tangible that you can actually do.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could come up with some pretty wild, wildly impractical rules for sustainability that uh, would be really difficult to convince people that they should adopt those or embrace those ideas for sure. Bjorn.
You kind of just hit on what I was gonna say, but I think education is huge, and that's probably a really, really common problem that happens is needing to convince local people or trying to convince local people of why they shouldn't just make money, which in a lot of cases that's why people are doing what they're doing is so they can get financial gain. And if it's in a kind of poor area, coming in and trying to explain to them, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that, or we should find a better way to do that, that might not always make sense to them at that time. And so I think trying to figure out a way to a compromise with them, but also explain that in a way that, benefits everybody is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and you hit on one of the big things that I would point out, which is the uh, consumerist type of society that we live in, likes things that you can spend money on. That's capitalism. That you can use for a relatively short period of time before they break or become out of style or otherwise need to be purchased again. That then will go into a landfill somewhere, so that you can put more money into the system, and do that ad nauseum until you die. That is the current general paradigm upon which we function. That's why I have a closet full of t-shirts that I'll probably never wear, for example, because I have just continually continue to consume. I continue to spend and fill my closet with t-shirts. Far more t-shirts than it is practical. Well, there's no reason to have 45 t-shirts. I don't know how many I have, but it's probably that many. Like that's ridiculous. And I know that. And I don't buy t-shirts anymore, but my wife still buys me t-shirts, and I can't stop her. She's unstoppable. Um, but it's wasteful. And change how do you change that? Like how does one go about changing that? That idea that like, well, how do you change it let's not even look at it from the consumer perspective. How about from the perspective of industry? How do you convince industry not to produce a product that will uh, break at a predetermined time? They have mathematical models that it's called the Weibull function, and it tells you about the life of a product. Um, and they can literally engineer things to break within a certain amount of time, like to stop functioning. How do you convince industry not to do that and to make products that last longer? Tiffany.
So I know this happens a lot in fast fashion as well, that we're making clothes that wear out faster. So you have to keep buying more. I think from what I see, what a lot of people are trying to do is to convince the consumer to no longer have a demand for this product. If they no longer demand it, then the industries don't want to make it. So we're trying to find alternative products to convince industry that these are the products that we want. I'm sure there's tons of different methods of convincing consumers that the product is terrible, find something else worth it. But first you have to address poverty. So, I mean, people are buying cheap things because that's all they can afford. And so it's expensive to be poor. So somehow creating a demand for a better product without also minimizing the fact that poverty exists.
Yeah, very good. That hits at one of the two core hearts of the matter. This is something that I have been personally struggling with a lot in the last 2 months as I've just thought more and more about this, is that when we, and maybe I've talked to you guys about this. I don't know if I've already talked about this. If I have, you can just raise your hand and tell me to shut up. Um, when we approach conservation, we approach the animal and we try to fix the problem for the animal. That is putting a bandage on a gaping wound. That is what that is. And I hate to say that because everyone in this room, that's what we want to do because that's what we're passionate about, right? Like we want to work with animals and help the animals. The underlying condition that creates those problems is poverty, education, and uh, our the certain culture that has arisen from those aspects of our society. Um, if we could fix those things, conservation would come quite easily. Does that make sense? So the underlying problem is a human problem. Telling the poor people just to not do that thing because it's bad for whatever animal, like that is never going to work. It's never going to work. You have to fix the underlying problem. It's like giving someone Tylenol for, a decapitation. It doesn't make a lot of sense. We ha we have to fix the underlying problem. So this is literally something that I have sat down at lunch and talked to Dr. Loafman about. I've had conversations with a few different people about because it's like, how do we fix that? Well, that requires all of us to stop being conservation biologists and start being politicians. That's the reality, right? If you want to change those things, if you want to change education in our country, if you want to change poverty, you don't do that by cleaning the snake tanks in 305. You don't do that by, you know, going out and surveying for owls, Cleo. Like that's not what you do, actually. That will help the owls or the snakes or whatever a little bit, but it won't fix the underlying problem that's going to persistently harm those things. And that's a human thing. What do you guys think about that?
Is this your candidate announcement right now, McKinney?
I have genuinely thought about it, Bjorn, but I just don't think that life is aligned in such a way that that's currently feasible. But what do you think about it? Do you agree? Are you like, no, that's wrong? It's okay to disagree. Tiffany.
I agree, but I think a very interesting thing, my curator right now, I've worked with her for 10 years. She originally was going to go into law school for like environmental protection and stuff like that, but basically got just discouraged from everything. One, law school, because law school sucks. But also just the state of trying to be political and doing law stuff in that scope just seemed so discouraging that she's like, I'd rather work with the animals themselves and work from it from that side of the problem because she didn't feel like she could do enough from the law and political aspect. So I think that might be pretty common in the conservation and kind of zookeeping world where people are like, I didn't feel like there was any other way I could help. So they felt that that was their last thing was I'm going to do field biology, I'm going to do zookeeping, I'm going to do rehabilitation, things like that, because they didn't feel equipped to do it from a different aspect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Because no singular politician, unless we have a dictatorship, let's hope we don't go there, no singular politician gets to make decisions about our education or gets to make decisions about how we support people in poverty to reverse uh, those problems, right? No single politician makes those decisions, at least not in the United States, right? We have a Senate, we have a House, we have a president, we have an executive branch, we have a judicial branch. All of those individuals and those three branches have to, in some way, shape, or form, function as a whole to create those processes. So, but it takes many, many people standing up and moving in that direction to get there. You're right. Any one person wandering into, especially right now, wandering into that world is going to be really discouraged. I mean, horribly so. And that's, I think, a very good point. Bjorn.
Man, I think you guys are really hitting on what I was going to say as well, but I like you still need biologists. Like if
Yeah,
everybody goes
absolutely.
and becomes politicians, which I can't, I'd be a terrible politician. I'm telling you right now, I am not cut out for that. That would be a very, very bad idea. But I can clean snake poop. Like I can do that pretty well. And so it's like you need, I mean, if we all went and became politicians, like who would be, doing the analysis on the environment and the species. And so, I do think that you make a very, very good point that we need that push within politics, but we need that to come from both, politicians and biologists working together.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, we need, for example, we know like we need to understand, for example, the natural history of an organism to make good, sound decisions about conservation. But my point is not to say all biologists should become politicians. That, of course, is ridiculous. Um, but my point is to say is that if we want to stem the tide of destruction wrought by humans that is going to continue to get worse and worse and worse, we have to fix the underlying problems that are creating the tide in the first place. And those are things like poverty and education. Jasmine.
I'm with most of y'all. I was a little kid that got told I should run for president or be a lawyer, which is exactly why you shouldn't go into politics, because it means that you are very opinionated and, you know, people are actually telling you to shut up. Um, and as someone whose grandma blocked them, like I try to educate people. And I'm afraid I might tell it in ways that wouldn't be satisfying, but I make sure to just tell the truth because I couldn't become a politician. I went into biology, but I still think it's part of our responsibility as scientists, whatever realm we're in, as scientists, to share the knowledge that we have, even if it might make others uncomfortable or feel guilty. They can just learn to sit in that. Part of the reason I think why we're in a problem is because people don't like to sit in the fact that they are contributing to these things. So I think it is part of our responsibility to them to inform the people in our lives, even if we're not up on a podium informing a large crowd. If you just go home and update your family on something you learned this week, that might be a little bit depressing, but explain why it shouldn't be too depressing. Like these are the ways that we're mitigating that. I think that's really important. And I have changed people in my lives. I have changed their minds through these conversations. But like I said, I also got blocked by my own grandma. So um, results may vary.
Yeah. So a couple things to say there. First, you mentioned people feeling uncomfortable sitting in their own guilt when it comes to environmental problems. I mean, really, people feel uncomfortable with that in any form, right? It doesn't have to be related to environment or conservation, but in any form. Um, and so you might ask yourself, you said, well, that's a problem. And maybe it is a problem. And I think in some ways it is. How do you overcome that? How do you get people to feel comfortable sitting in their own guilt? Tiffany has an
Remind
answer.
them.
Oh,
Oh,
go
I
ahead.
was gonna
Go
say
ahead,
you can
Jasmine.
remind them that you don't have to stand in the frying pan and complain that it's hot. You can do something. If you feel
Okay.
guilty, you can do something to absolve yourself of that or work towards absolving yourself of that.
So sure. Well, I mean, not all things are, not all actions are redeemable, at least not in my mind. Um, so that's not always possible. It may not be possible from a practical standpoint to say, you know, talk to the poor about, someone that's poor that is running a straight pipe into a creek, uh, for example, and you say like, oh, this is really bad for the water. Well, I don't have enough money to fix it, so now I just feel bad and still have to keep doing the same thing I'm already doing. Not all things are fixable. So how can you universally can allow people to sit in their guilt? Is there any way to do that? Tiffany.
Okay, my joke answer was therapy, but everyone should
Oh,
be in therapy. Um, but which is legitimate. Like some people should probably
yeah.
be in therapy. That'll help. But I think also something that might also, it's kind of akin to therapy that might be beneficial is to make them realize that a lot of the time it's a shared guilt, that this isn't a problem caused by one singular human. This is a group project. We all contributed. So they shouldn't keep it so insular. Um,
That's a good
share the
point.
guilt with other people, even if it's just your community, just your household, just your family. Like, it's not just you for most of these things. You might have done something that you feel really terrible about, but that's not the end of the world. You didn't cause the extinction of a specific frog. That was not your fault. That was a group of things. So I think just giving people spaces to be like, yeah, I feel really bad about this. How can we fix this? Like, what's the one thing, little tiny thing I can do to kind of pick up this group project that we failed so terribly? But yeah, everyone should be in therapy.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, Ryan.
Yeah, I don't think you can necessarily, I don't think there's any great way to necessarily get people to accept their, or not accept, but just, what did you guys, how did you say it?
Well,
Sit in their
they
guilt
were
and let
saying
them accept their
sitting
guilt.
in guilt, but you could say
Yeah, but
accepting
I think,
responsibility, I think.
yeah, responsibility, because like I'm one of those people where like I'm talking about human effects on nature. I will say we, us, all of us. Like I myself didn't go chop down trees, but my species did. And I kind of feel like, well, even though I'm not doing it, like we collectively have done it, I'm not doing a whole lot as one person to help. So like this is a group effort as we talked about. And this is a team effort. So I think you kind of just have to, I guess maybe going with what Jasmine said, you kind of have to just accept it, like deal with it. That's something that you're going to have to feel. You don't necessarily need to get over your guilt or I guess even accept it, but it's what you do now. Like if you are feeling guilt, I can't make you feel less guilty, but you can make yourself feel less guilty by doing so and so or participating in so and so. So yeah, that's how I guess that's where I stand on that. Just deal with it, move on, try to make yourself better. It's all you can do.
Okay. I think there's at least one other thing. I don't want to go too deep into it because I don't want to stray too far from our actual topic, but um, I think there are, and this basically ties into education. I think there are certain philosophies that emphasize ways, and probably these are things that they might teach you in therapy, actually, that might emphasize ways to manage those sorts of feelings. Um, there is as examples, some aspects of Stoic philosophy that talk about managing your feelings in various ways, and also in Buddhist philosophy that discuss that. I only speak to those ones because they're what I'm interested in right now, and I've been reading quite a lot of. But certainly uh, other philosophy covers those topics as well. But that's education. You can't ship Epictetus to all the people that are guilty and be like, read this and feel better about yourself, obviously, right? But if we incorporated those sorts of things more into our educational system, maybe people could handle their internal struggles a little bit better without having to go to a therapist, right? We could teach them to do those things without having to pay someone $90 an hour. Bjorn.
I think we're way far away from like this scenario of people actually feeling guilty. Like I don't want people to feel guilty and feel bad, but if people felt like legitimately guilty for, the negative environmental consequences of their actions, I feel like we'd be in much better shape today than we are. I think the problem is that people don't feel guilty. They don't have remorse, and it's either A, they don't care, or B, they just don't have the time or the energy or the resources to care because they're just too busy surviving. So I don't necessarily think that we're even close to this kind of conversation of guilt necessarily of like helping people get through this. I think we're still at the place of explaining to people why why it's a bad thing and why they should actually care in the first place.
I think that's an extremely, extremely good point, Bjorn, and I agree with you almost 100%. I think there is some subset of people, but they're a minority of all the people we would be concerned about. Um, but that kind of goes back to we're almost full circle as, I would come to the point that like to fix those things, to put people into a life where they're not just trying to get from day to day breathing, and actually like really live a life, we have to fix the underlying issues in our culture, things like extreme poverty, and a very poor education, and that would help take care of that. And then maybe people would have time to internally reflect on their actions, and maybe they could feel guilty, and maybe they could apply uh, philosophy to overcome that. Maybe we could get to that point. But yeah, I agree. The first thing is just fixing the underlying issue. Uh, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think about it like every single day. So worth thinking about. Do you else have any other thoughts about that? Okay. We could honestly, there's probably enough to talk about that for like a full other hour, but we're not going to. The Brundtland report, we can move past that. I just wanna, we only got like 40, not even 40 minutes left. Let's get a question 12. I mean, if we shoot too far ahead, we can go back. So the author argues, as we have discussed previously, that humans are part of the wild. He cites examples, both past and present, of our shaping of wild places. What are some modern examples? So this is sort of a revisiting of the very beginning of the semester. Let's see what we remember from that. Jasmine.
I said national parks, like Yosemite, Yellowstone. You also mentioned Kruger National Park was one. And then I also put in things like Muir Woods, where like you're hiking, but you're kind of in the wild, but a lot of the animals are very used to people.
Good. Caitlin, you have anything to add?
I listed bears within national parks as a very specific example. They're a large carnivore that often get habituated to people, which is a man-made problem. Like we are creating that problem and managing that problem. They're often relocated. Sometimes they're unfortunately killed if they're a repeat problem bear. Sometimes they go into zoos or sanctuaries. So, like, that is us very directly managing the wild within a place that we consider wild, like a national park.
Yeah. Anybody else have any other examples or thoughts? Okay. I mean, we talked about that a lot at the beginning. I think, very first chapter. All right. So, but that transitions into question 13, which is worth talking about in a little more detail. Do you think, as some scientists have argued, that because no place is truly wild in the classical sense of wild, that we should abandon the concept of wild and just focus on human need. Tiffany.
Uh, I don't think we should abandon the concept of wild just because wild doesn't look the same as how we imagined it. That kind of feels like a temper tantrum. That's not what I wanted, so I don't want to have it. Um, and even what we think of as wild, like the classical sense, um, that wild would have changed anyway. That's literally how evolution works. It never stays the same over centuries. So there is no specific way to keep something the same if it is a functioning ecosystem. That's not how they're literally meant to change. So why would we stop something from changing if that's what it's meant to do? And I feel we can't just focus on human needs. That's the problem already. We only focused on what humans need, and now we've destroyed the wild in a lot of cases. So we can't just abandon it because it's not what we expected it to be. We need to take human needs into consideration, but we shouldn't focus just on human needs. They should be part of the equation.
Okay. I have a point I want to argue about that, but I'm going to let Taylor go first.
I was just gonna say that I think focusing on and preserving the wild is a human need because like we rely on a lot of the things that they provide us, like the oxygen and
Mhm.
the water. Like those are really important things, and if we just completely abandon it, that's really gonna negatively impact us if we're just gonna think about it as in a selfish perspective. Like obviously there's other reasons, but I think that's a valid reason. If you want to think about yourself and like gotta look out for number one, like I think thinking about the wild for us is important as well.
Very good, Taylor. You pretty well said exactly what I was going to say. So, Tiffany, you said like, thinking about what we were thinking from a human needs perspective, but we really haven't been, and that's how we ended up in this mess to begin with, right? Is if we really thought about what people need, we need a stable planet to live on before anything else, before we need cars or cell phones or 45 t-shirts in our closet. We just need a planet that's not going to catch on fire. So we haven't thought enough about human needs. Yes, Bjorn.
First, Tiffany, I thought it was really funny that you compared that to like a temper tantrum because I literally have in my answer that it seems like a hopeless tantrum-based reasoning to just like abandon wild. But I think one of my biggest problems with this like whole argument that, no place is truly wild, so we should just abandon it. It's like, okay, so when did we start losing wild? Like when did things start to become unwilded by humans? At what point are we gonna say that's like, all right, it's no longer wild? Was it when we started like making fire or made the wheel, or was it when we put like the first roads in place or made the first buildings? At that point, like I feel like a lot of people would argue it's infrastructure, which I agree with to some extent, but it's like, okay, but like what kind of infrastructure? Are we talking about, places where they're still making homes and huts out of natural materials? Because a lot of those places still exist. Like, is that still wild? Or so back in time, was that when like it's just such a difficult thing to answer, and it's not a black and white issue, and I feel like so many of these arguments turn it into exactly that. So it's not about whether or not something is wild the way we think about it. I think a lot of it is just redefining what we think of as wild. And I think the other point I wanted to just talk about briefly, because I was obsessed with these videos for a little while of like time lapses. If there was like, an apocalypse and all humans got eliminated, like if a disease and a plague comes through and wipes us all out, and just watching like the plants reclaim cities, those are such cool videos. And it's like, okay, well, is that place, never wild again? Because, also in like movies like I Am Legend, when you have, mountain lions hunting deer in the middle of the city, it looks pretty damn wild to me. So can it get rewilded? Like it's just such a very, very intricate and complicated topic that people tend to simplify. And I think questions like this really just kind of play on that black and white negative with just eliminating the gray area completely.
What's really good transition to the next two questions, actually. Really good. It's like you did that on purpose. So what's green argue makes a place wild? Um, and then if someone wants to just, it's very easy to segue from 14 into 15. Explain Green's rattlesnake example as in the issue of zoos and wildness, given his definition. Annabeth.
I will do it.
All right.
Okay. So I put down for question 14 that the argument of makes a place wild is that it entails locale appropriate ecological and evolutionary processes, including predation, competition, selection, disturbance, nutrient cycling. Bleh. And I think it's a very accurate definition. Um, so in the rattlesnake example, they have like forgot exactly which zoo it had it in, but they had a in human care rattlesnake, and it has this area that it lives in, and then it gets fed a rat every so often. That's like 10% of its body weight, I think, or mass. Um, and then it's compared to a rattlesnake in the wild where it can roam. It has this large area that it can roam, and sometimes it eats prey that is like the size of its body. It will take down like rabbits and stuff, and not a frozen thawed rat. Um, so it's just that comparison where that rattlesnake in human care only gets a small percentage of the quote unquote like wild that a wild rattlesnake would have.
Yeah, good. So essentially, wildness by Green's idea, this is an idea that I tend to resonate with pretty strongly myself, is wildness is natural ecological processes being able to occur, even in the presence of people. Many processes that are completely natural ecological processes can occur. For example, if you were to go to the West Liberty Bird Observatory, which sounds fancy, but it's just a bunch of nets in a wetland, just so you know. Um, that's in a wetland. The soil microorganisms in that wetland are still doing all of the cool anoxic chemical conversions that they would do in any other wetland. That process is occurring. It's the natural process the wetlands do. The birds are breeding, completely natural process. They're calling territorially, completely natural process. Uh, they're chasing each other around. The deer are bedding down in the wetland. All of the things that should be happening in that wetland are happening, even so, uh, we are present in that space. And as a matter of fact, that space is right in the middle of town. Not that West Liberty is very big, but it's literally right in the middle of town. So that is a fairly wild place in my mind, even though it's right in the middle of town. All of those things are still occurring. Bjorn.
I thought it was really interesting his definition of wild in this book compared to like um was it
Wow.
5 years later in A Wilder Kingdom? Because we're still
Yeah.
in the arc, right? So it
Yeah.
seems like he also had some revisions on kind of his thoughts of what wild really is, some character development from scientist to goober, I guess, according to Jasmine. Um, but yeah, I think that I agree with you. I really kind of like this thought, but I think I like it even more when paired with his newer ideas of it also being a place where people are interacting mindfully with the ecosystem. Because I think there are a lot of cases where you could argue that it's like, well, those biological processes are still happening, but it's in the parking lot of a Walmart, and I wouldn't necessarily, in my opinion, call that wild because I don't
Mm.
feel like that's a place where we're necessarily interacting mindfully with the ecosystem. It just so happens that some organisms can still, undergo those processes because they're very resilient. But yeah, I think the pairing of those two kind of really resonated with me.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And when I think of this, I guess I think of it Yeah, I wouldn't consider a Walmart parking lot wild just because house sparrows can make babies in a Walmart parking lot bush somewhere. Uh, which it's not, to me, it wouldn't be that any singular natural ecological process could occur, but that you had a stable uh, ecological structure where many, like the full suite of processes were occurring. Um, but yeah, I guess I don't know. I'd have to really think more about how I would exactly define what that looked like and what the threshold was. It's pretty difficult, I think, to do that. It's a good point. Um, and so the rattlesnake example, though, and this is sort of an issue of zoos versus wildness, right? It was just that a rattlesnake in captivity does not have the same opportunity to experience and be integrated into natural ecological processes, and so really can't be considered wild by that definition, right? As a zoo animal. Um, no matter how wild looking, naturalistic you make its enclosure, um, it's that enclosure is a little isolated box that is, uh, it's kept away from, it's separated from those processes, including the food items it gets to eat. But we're talking about all the processes, right? It doesn't have to be worried, for example, about a hawk swooping down and killing it. It doesn't have to worry about those things either. So question 16, I know we've talked about this already, but we have to talk about it to talk about question 17 that I do want to talk about. So question 16, very, very briefly, is are there cultural differences in our perspectives on handling captive animals? This is talking about Marius the giraffe. So one person, real quick, give the rundown. Go. Not everybody at once. Tiffany.
So Marius the giraffe was a baby giraffe that was born at a zoo in Denmark. He was not he was not going to contribute to the captive population genetically. He was overrepresented. So the facility decided to euthanize him, do a public necropsy on him so people could come if they wanted to watch. And then his remains were fed to the lions housed at the facility. The international community was up in an uproar. They thought it was inhumane, that it was really poor showmanship, things like that. While the domestic people, both professional and non-professional in Denmark, found it, they agreed with it. They thought it was worth it, that it was a good showing, and that the international viewpoint was basically trying to hide the fact that animals are culled in captivity.
Good. Okay, so that's the overview of the Marius the giraffe thingy, if you didn't recall already. So question 17, though, is tied directly to that. These two different cultural perspectives on managing the draft. So question 17 is, would you choose the United States or Denmark under Green's cosmic dice example? I like the cosmic dice example. So someone can briefly explain what this example is, and then what would you choose and why? Caitlin.
Okay. So basically, it was, would you rather, potentially be a giraffe here in the United States where you might never breed? You'll probably live a long life, but you might have zero breeding opportunities. You might have like limited social opportunities, or you can be a giraffe in Denmark and I think in the example, you're like a bull giraffe is like one idea, and like you get multiple opportunities to breed. Or maybe you're not genetically valuable and you have a good life and then are culled. That was like the basic concept, I chose Denmark because I think your life could be potentially more dynamic in Denmark. And even if your life is short and you're not genetically valuable, you're still going to live a good life. It's just going to be short. But like the animals receive quality care for as long as they're alive. Their life is just not as long as if they're a breeding giraffe.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? Did anyone choose USA? Taylor, you chose USA? Tell us about that.
I mean, I'll basically I just like I prefer to live over having sex. Like I just think it's better. Like if I had to choose one or the other, I'm gonna choose living. I mean, it's both are great, but I'm definitely gonna choose living a little longer. I guess I don't know. I didn't think like I thought it was kind of funny that like oh like maybe if like in the Denmark situation, like you get to travel, like giraffes don't care. Like they don't want to. They don't care about traveling. It's probably just gonna be a more stressful experience for them, anyways. I could have like a pro, like a like a positive for that argument. Like they don't want to do that, but yeah. So I did choose U.S.
I think you make a good argument for the US. All right. Bjorn.
Gonna say I also said Denmark, but I'm glad Caitlin you went first because I went from a slightly different perspective because I also said in my answer that without this feeling of wanting to preserve natural ecosystems and understanding like the cycle of nutrients and the balance of nature, if I didn't have any of this, I would probably just focus on self-preservation. Like I'm definitely coming at this question from a biased perspective just because like I would rather have my life have some kind of value to the environment and I feel like that's how I could do that the most. But if I didn't have that understanding, then I would probably pick the States just to save myself because I feel like if I take all of that away, it would be just very, very basic instincts kicking in of self-preservation.
Okay. Caitlin.
Another point I should have added initially, like they do so not so much a giraffe thing, but like the chapter also talks about like carcass feeds. Like it isn't just the giraffes that could potentially have a more dynamic life. Like some of the carnivores have more dynamic lives. I went to a small carnivore workshop in the Netherlands and it was very eye-opening and they do things very differently than we do here. But like I also saw a lot of cool things. I saw like a big pack feed where they like dumped, I can't remember now, it was a horse carcass or a cow carcass into a pack of painted dogs and they let them all tear it apart. And like some of them were more like aggressive and more assertive and were like got better pieces, but like that is how a pack would function. And I think
Mhm.
that like that's worth thinking about too outside of the breeding stuff.
Sure. Yeah, they get more. Yeah, the breeding giraffe example, you can be a little bit funny with it. It's sex or death, basically. Um, or yeah, sex in a short life, potentially, or guaranteedly long, healthy life, no sex is essentially the giraffe thing. But yeah, you can talk about the other natural, dynamic kind of life you might live under the different system as well. And that's a great point. Um, I think this is a very difficult question, and I think it really depends on a lot about what you consider when you consider what the meaning of life really is and what the purpose of life is. And if you think of it in a Darwinian sense, it's to make babies. Now, there are many other ways to think about the meaning of life, and that's just one of them. But very clearly, life, that's how life functions, right? If you think about, I mean, my God, if you're in the ornithology class and we talked about all the stuff with breeding this semester, like so much of how birds behave, it's everything is gotta have sex, gotta have sex, gotta make babies. Like it's all about making babies as efficiently as possible, and that's true for all animals, actually. Um, so making babies is a really important aspect of life. And if that will be taken from you, that can be a significant deal. Um, and I don't know that I am cool with that being taken from me as this theoretical draft. So I think I would go with Denmark just because I wouldn't want that meaning to be stolen, if that makes any sense. Okay. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to move forward. I think there's other stuff to talk about there. Hmm. Talk about question 20 real quick, and I would like to talk about the discussion question, but I don't know that we're going to be able to. Let's talk about question 20. So how can zoos make us see animals as others or as objects? Cleo.
Through caging them, they can be seen as objects rather than beings with the will and freedom to interact with humans or on their own terms.
Okay. Um, can you expand on that at all?
Like, they're seen as objects as there's people frequently going through, so they don't have like, if I mean, they have like hides and stuff probably, but I guess whenever you're looking at them, they're kind of forced to interact with you, so you kind of see them as more of an object, if that makes sense.
Okay. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I wrote down points about poor housing, small spaces, used for entertainment or used for profit, which I think are all very important, but it's something I just kind of connected now. Earlier in these chapters, we kind of talk about a hobbyist view, and I think designing exhibits in a specific way can affect how people see animals as others. So from that hobbyist view, or maybe you have aquariums that showcase more of like the pump systems or something, or if you have an exhibit that's not necessarily natural for the animal, but like you can see all of their runs and holdings and shift doors pretty obviously, stuff like that is going to make them be seen as others or objects versus like if you see them in like a natural habitat and a natural exhibit doing natural animal behaviors, they might be seen more um similar, more, I don't know what the word for it is, less of another, I suppose. So the environment that they're in, I think, has a big impact on that.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Bjorn.
I think the really scary thing with these like animal shows and like, bad zoos and stuff is when the entertainment value seems to like overshadow the morals and the ethics of the people. So even sometimes if people go in there with, these certain values, oftentimes once they're there, they're focusing on their own experience instead of like the animal's well-being. And so they're the whole show and the experience itself can just kind of overplay any feelings that, those people may have had. And so even sometimes if they, from an outside perspective will look at that and be like, oh, that's wrong, that sucks. Sometimes they'll still stay there, they'll still watch, they'll still support the business. And that for me is oftentimes when it switches from, people seeing the animals as other beings and switches to others or objects.
Yeah, I think you guys all made really good points there. And um, the point to take away, I think, from this is just that it is there. We should use caution in how we display animals and the way we interact with animals, so that when people come to the zoo, they don't take that away from the experience, right? That they view them as valuable living entities and not as objects. That's really what it comes down to. Um, Real briefly, as briefly as we can, I would like to talk for just a minute or two about the last question, mostly because I just want to hear what your thoughts are. Um, and it doesn't have to be for very long. Now, at the end of the semester, has your perspective on zoos changed? The whole point of this class was not to make you dislike what zoos do or like what zoos do, but to make you hopefully see from a conservation perspective where zoos sit in that whole realm of conservation. Um, and on the wild as well, since we talked quite a bit about the wild. Have you, as potential future zookeepers, curators, and collectors, developed a zoo conservation philosophy that you can take with you to your jobs? Basically, what I'm asking here is has this class changed your perspectives on anything that you have found to be valuable? And maybe someone want to throw out anything that is how, in a way, it's affected them. Tiffany.
So I don't, it hasn't necessarily changed my perspective on zoos. I've been working in zoos for a decade now, so I've already confronted a lot of these conversations before this class. But I think the one thing it did really kind of change my perspective of, especially since I've worked at small facilities, um, is how much more my facilities could be doing conservation wise, even if it's just little steps. So, for example, I'm already talking to my curator. I really want to do American burying beetle work, and I really want to get into that. So, I've been more vocal and more proactive about joining conservation initiatives. And it just so happens that the facility I'm at now is really into that. But also kind of making me a little bit more critical and really looking into what other facilities are doing, and how either I could contribute to that, like partner with things, or see how they're kind of going about it and using those steps, those ideas for how my facility could possibly do something similar. Maybe not the same animal, but same idea. So I've definitely I've talked to my curator all the time about what we talk about in here. For example, I told her that our chapter was talking about Clyde Peeling's Reptiland. That's where we came from. Both of our last facilities was Clyde Peeling Reptiland. So I had to tell her to be like, ah, Bonita and Sapo's pictures in the book. I think that's the main perspective change was is that at my facility I could be doing more, and I really want to be proactive about that.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Does anybody else want to share? If not, it's okay. All right, Bjorn.
To say I had my hand raised. I actually lowered it because Tiffany, I think you like verbatim said exactly what I was gonna say as well. Like I don't think my perspective on zoos overall has changed, but there are definitely like little aspects within there where my perspective has definitely shifted or my eye has been opened a little bit. And I think one of those things for me was how not involved in conservation a lot of facilities are, even if they kind of pretend to be. And so it's really also kind of changed my perspective to ensure that, whatever facility I'm working at, it's not just for show. It's just not, it's not just like surface level. We have these, threatened species on display, but it's much more in depth. Like we're looking at the populations, we are analyzing all of that, and we're actually playing a significant role because I mean, as far as what we've read, especially in like these last few weeks, it seems like zoos have a lot to improve on. And so that was really cool to read. But I will also say that was really awesome to read about a lot of the history of zoos. I mean, I knew a lot of it, but I also learned a lot, which was very, very cool. And so, in addition to what I just said, having that historical knowledge and then being able to want to take this new perspective and kind of run with it into the future, I think is very cool. But I've also learned a lot from all of you guys. I thought the discussions were really, really awesome. And we have such a really cool knowledge base here in the class. So I had a lot of fun talking to all you guys about this too.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else like to say anything? Ryan.
Yeah, just real quick, because I kind of already yapped about this earlier, but um I think I definitely have a lot of views that have changed. I think my initially before taking this class, I had much more positive views on zoos in general and my own zoo, which I still have positive views, but I definitely think I'm looking at things a lot more critical now, especially when it comes to breeding programs, conservation, public engagement, some of the things that I think I already felt very strongly about, but I now have a little bit more of a foundation to go off of from being in the course. And then, like I said earlier, I don't think if I didn't have the kind of understanding I have now, I might have applied for the trip, but I don't think I would be going with the mission that I have for my conservation trip to Guatemala. I think maybe would have looked at it more as oh, I get to work with wild animals. And now it's like, no, there's purpose to this. There's things I can do. I have all these plans, and I think this class was perfect timing for that even because now I'm bettering myself and I'm bettering my zoo, which I think is both really important. And I also just really liked this class in general. I think I learned a lot, and a lot of you guys are very experienced and helped me understand things in a much better way. And I hope to one day be as experienced or at least have the same type of knowledge. So I really enjoyed the class and talking with everyone.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Well, I would like to just say that I have really enjoyed this group and all of our discussions. I go home, every Tuesday night at 10, and my wife will be like, "How's the class?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I'm tired, but it was a really great discussion." And you all have, taught me some things as well, just from your experiences. Obviously each one of you has your own particular set of experiences that you bring to the table to these discussions. And it's really nice to not like sit in lecture, but have a discussion and then get to learn something myself instead of just iterating, something that I've talked about 100 times in a classroom. And been a really great experience for me. So thank you all for all of your contributions. And I will miss our conversations. I have the feeling next time I teach this class, it won't be, I won't have as many highly experienced students because, the first time I taught it, there was only like 4 students and 3 of them were undergraduates, actually, that we had undergrads taking a grad class. And it was not like this. It was a very different experience. So again, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading your final submissions in another week or so. And if you have any questions about it between now and then, just email me. So everyone have a great night, and hopefully I'll talk to you later. I don't know. We'll see. Some of you I know I will. Bye.